характеризовать на такие периоды, на такие даты. Мы сейчас, у нас как с перерывом? Когда у нас перерыв? Сейчас должен быть. Давайте мы сейчас, я просто вам покажу один небольшой клип, он пару минут всего лишь, тоже это как своего рода панорама истории или хронологии Израиля. Вы посмотрите на него, и потом мы сделаем перерыв сразу после этого. Как раз удобный момент.
God has always had a plan for his creation. Rescue was part of the design. It was a plan that would take time. After all, would you know it was a rescue if you didn't know you needed it? Would you believe only God could do it if you thought you could rescue yourself? It began in the garden. Adam and Eve wanted equality with God, but instead discovered death. But God covered their shame, and in death gave them a son and the promise of a future. But the slide into sin continued. Through Noah, God saved humanity from itself. But starting over, even through a righteous man, couldn't stop mankind's inclination to sin. Promised to be the father of a nation, Abraham believed, and God called him righteous. Yet his sins would fracture his children, and rebellion would follow them everywhere they went. In Egypt, God delivered Joseph from captivity and brought reconciliation and prosperity to his father's house. But in time, Jacob's descendants would find themselves a nation of slaves, their good legacy forgotten. In the desert of deliverance, God gave Moses a framework for obedience. The law was good, but it incited rebellion, and a rescued nation became a wandering generation. In the Promised Land, Israel learned that God was good to his word, yet longed to place their trust in men. But rather than abandon his people, God gave them judges who both delivered and failed the people. In the shepherd, David, God gave his people a king after his own heart, both warrior and poet. Even David failed the people, but God turned his weakness into the promise of a new heir on a forever throne. Through Solomon, God blessed his people with wisdom, but even the wisest of men become fools, and the earthly throne began to fracture. In the cries of the prophets, a wayward nation was called back to worship, and a stubborn people were promised a new law to rescue them. In exile, the last earthly remains of Israel were torn down. But after 70 years, God returned them to their homes and told them to start building because the time was coming. The signs were delivered, the prophecies ready to be fulfilled, the people in a posture to remember that there's a greater first son who would deliver us from sin, a greater Noah who would save humanity forever, a greater Abraham who would father a new nation, a greater Joseph whose legacy could be enslaved by no force, a greater Moses who would deliver a new law immune to our rebellion, a greater judge who defends the righteous and fulfills the requirements of the law, a greater David who shepherds and delivers his people from the giants of sin, a greater Solomon whose wisdom cannot be corrupted, a greater prophet whose call to worship and repentance was open to all people, a greater deliverer who leads us out of eternal exile. God always had a plan to reconcile his creation. And finally, it was time. At the crossroads of the world, in the face of an occupying oppressor, under the cover of night and the light of a star, in the city of David, the rescue begins.
Спасибо.